get started. Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Castelny, CEO of Preservation Virginia. Welcome. And I want to begin by acknowledging that, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where our offices are located, the Monacan Nation, and pay our respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. We welcome you all today, and we're grateful to our presenters, Kendall Crawford, Dr. Lakshmi Fjord, Karen Spites, and Kyle Spencer, and to our moderator, Nia Bates, for committing their time and energy to this important discussion. During the Q&A, Julie Langen and Elizabeth Lipford from DHR will also join us. And I want to thank Sonia Ingram from our staff who organized today's session. It's no easy task to get us all together. In the interest of time, we'll forego formal introductions of our speakers. So I would encourage you to visit our website to read their entire bios of these talented experts. When you're in the offices of Preservation Virginia, the phone rings, the email is received, and all too frequently, we learn a place of underrepresented history is threatened by a project that places unfair environmental burdens on already economically disadvantaged communities. This troubling environmental justice trend is evident on our annual list of Virginia's most endangered historic places. Large-scale utility infrastructure projects, including the Mountain Valley and Atlantic Coast pipelines, and electric utility projects, too often impact marginalized communities. Proposals like the landfill at Pine Grove and the water treatment plant at the sacred site of Rossawick reflect the disregard for these significant historic places. Issues of sea level rise and recurrent flooding disproportionately affect communities of color. And transportation projects that bisect sensitive resources and sacred grounds are all too common. Our listings help spotlight these advocacy efforts to encourage greater participation with individuals and groups that spearhead the fights to preserve these communities. But what does it take to get ahead? How do we convince backers of projects to acknowledge and respect these sites before a project begins? Why aren't there community representatives at the table at the beginning of the process to determine alternatives that preserve the history and manage the need for growth? There are encouraging signs. Governor Northam's establishment of the Virginia Council on Environmental Justice is a forum to raise issues and address concerns. In the 2021 General Assembly session, Senator McClellan sponsored a budget amendment to establish an outreach position at DHR to identify sites of underrepresented history and build the inventory in the VCRES database so that project planners are aware of and can avoid sensitive resources. It's just a start, and so much more is needed to resolve these century-long conflicts that disproportionately affect the historic places of memory of Indigenous people and of African Americans. Each of these topics that are on our agenda today could be a full session. So today is an introduction. In future sessions, we hope to dive deeper into individual efforts and with you, help find ways to shape solutions. We encourage your questions, add them to the Q&A box, and during the moderated session with Nia Bates, we will respond to as many as time allows. The session is being recorded and we'll post it on our website very shortly after today. And now I'd like to welcome Kendall Crawford, Director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, the state affiliate of the national organization dedicated to bringing together all faith communities to mobilize a religious response to climate change through energy conservation, energy efficiency, and renewable energy.
Thanks so much. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Great. I always like to like to check before I just start talking. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. I am just very excited. I'm always excited to have conversations about environmental justice, and you really have a wonderful lineup of speakers after me. So I will try to be very quick because I don't want to stand between you all and them. So I was asked, again, my name is Kendall Crawford. I was asked to just kind of give a quick overview of what is environmental justice and some of the recent highlights that have been happening here in Virginia in the past couple of years. And I will aim to do just that. So again, starting off with what is environmental justice. And then if we have time, I'd love to share with you all some resources. But if not, please feel free just to cut me off and we can just keep on rolling. Maybe we can send those resources out in the email afterwards. Okay, well, here we go. So what is environmental justice? I always like to start off with the Environmental Protection Agency definition. As you can see here, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So the two bold pieces you see there, fair treatment and meaningful involvement. And I want to delve a little bit deeper into those, but before I do, I wanted to share with you all the definition of environmental justice that is in the Virginia Code. So as you can see, it has those big phrases, fair treatment and meaningful involvement. But in addition to that, it has faith, and it also includes disability. And so this was a part of the Virginia Environmental Justice Act that was signed into law last year. So when we're thinking about environmental justice, we're really thinking about the intersection between social justice and environmental quality. And just keep in mind that the hope here is not that all communities are equally oppressed. We don't want all communities to be equally polluted and dangerous for all of us. Really, it is my belief that for environmental justice, we should be seeking to redistribute, not just be seeking to redistribute harms. Instead, we should be seeking to abolish them. And so, of course, the hope is that all communities, especially oppressed communities, low-income communities, communities of color, will find justice, and everyone can experience the benefits of a healthy, sustainable community with lots of resources for them to appreciate. So digging deeper into those two pieces, fair treatment and meaningful involvement. Fair treatment, that's pretty easy. It's the same for everyone. No segment of the population should face a disproportionate burden. And meaningful involvement, this one is particularly important because when we're talking about meaningful involvement, that means that agencies haven't already made up their decision, that communities actually do have an opportunity to participate in these discussions. They are taken seriously. The decision makers go back and they actually allow the input from the community to impact the decision. So it's not just, it should not just be tokenism. And then of course, as we see with other justice issues, whenever communities lack economic power or lack political power, environmental justice becomes a concern because their voices are not always heard. Wrapping up quickly here with kind of the basics of environmental justice. I always like to spotlight the environmental justice principles as well when I talk about the EPA definition. Why? Because it's important that communities speak for themselves. And so the environmental justice principles, they're pretty lengthy, so I won't go through them here, but I do encourage you all to check them out later if you've not already heard of them. But the EJ principles came about in 1991 as a result of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And these principles have served as one of the kind of the defining documents for the growing grassroots movement. The first principle, for instance, it talks about just the sacredness of Mother Earth, and the right for Mother Earth and all species to be free from ecological destruction. And then the principles keep, they go on, there's 17 of them, but the second one talks about the importance of public policy being based on mutual respect and justice for all people, being free from racism, being free from discrimination, being free from bias. And then the very last principle, number 17, talks about individuals and like consumer choices, like what we buy, what we choose to consume. And I think that that's a really important to think about kind of the sequencing, just because of including the last principle requiring, making us think more about personal choices. It really kind of makes us think, okay, the onus is on systems here. It's on our public policy. It's on the way these decisions are made. So I think that that's important. And if you have time, I definitely encourage you to check out the environmental justice principles. So I wanted to quickly move through a few of the highlights from the Northam administration. And these are only a few. Again, I don't have that much time. I was very much tempted to put in like a several year-long timeline that shows how we got to these big highlights here, because just having these quick 4 bullets definitely does not depict all of the asking, all of the good work of advocates and community folks across the Commonwealth to get here. But I'll just go ahead and run through the highlights real quick. So actually last week, very exciting that the Department of Environmental Quality hired their first Director of Environmental Justice, Renee Hoyos, and also a full-time environmental justice coordinator, Jerome Brooks. Jerome Brooks had been with the DEQ for about 15 years. But anyway, this announcement kind of starts the beginning of a brand new Office of Environmental Justice in the Department of Environmental Quality. And so all of that happened last week. Then if you're kind of going back a little bit further in time, last October, that was when that's when SKIO Solutions and Metropolitan Group, these are like consultant groups that DEQ had hired. They came in and did a several month-long study of environmental justice within the Department of Environmental Quality. So they interviewed community folks, they interviewed staff, they interviewed members of the nonprofit community. And at the end of all of those interviews, they released a set of recommendations, forward-looking, of how the DEQ should move forward and better incorporate environmental justice. So March 2020, I think I mentioned the Environmental Justice Act a little bit a few slides back, but that's when Governor Northam signed the Virginia Environmental Justice Act into law. And what that did was that it added to our state code the responsibility of the Commonwealth being to promote environmental justice. And it also defined environmental justice for the first time. So there are definitions for environmental justice communities. There's definition for fence line communities. And also during that time, he codified the Council on Environmental Justice, which hadn't been a permanent council. And then going back even further, December 2018, that was when the very first recommendations of the Virginia Council on Environmental Justice were actually sent to the governor. And so now if we kind of look back to those first recommendations in 2018, we're starting. We're starting. There's still so much more that needs to be done, but we're at least at the starting line. And then here are just some quick resources. I'll just kind of go quick through these because I don't want to take up that much more time. But maybe if you have if you're on your cell phone, you can screenshot it or we can send it around. But these are just some resources from the Department of Environmental Quality. I mentioned Renee Hoyos. Her email address is right here. She's the new director of EJ, and we need to keep her very, very busy because there are many environmental justice issues all across the Commonwealth. And then if you check this website out, you can also find out the study that I was talking about in the last slide, the study of DEQ. And then you also can find the Environmental Justice Interagency Working Group report, which is basically an internal assessment that that each agency did, looking at how the resources that that particular agency needs to better incorporate environmental justice. And then Secretary of Natural Resources also has a lot of resources for environmental justice. You can find the recommendations of the EJ Council. You can find who's on the membership list. I'm currently a member, so I'd love to chat with any and all of you. And then, of course, you can sign up for environmental justice updates there, and there's the meeting schedule as well. So that's it. I hope I didn't run too much over time. And again, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to share like the very, very tip of the iceberg in terms of the environmental justice.
No, thank you so much. As we said, this is our quick pass through, and certainly there's an opportunity to dive deeply into each of these topics. So I appreciate all of this good information, and we'll circulate some of those links in the chat box so people have access to that. Now I'd like to introduce Karen Spites. She is a resident, an ambassador for Chesterfield Heights, a historic 20th century African-American neighborhood in Norfolk. She's witnessed the devastating challenges of recurrent flooding on this historic community. Karen?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Spates, and I am a resident of the Chesterfield Heights community. Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to share my story. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about our neighborhood. My parents moved here along with my 6 brothers and sisters when I was about 5 years old in the early 60s. So I've spent a great deal of my life right here. One of the things my mom loved about this historic neighborhood was all the houses were a little different from one another, and the fact that several of her friends from the old neighborhood moved here too. It was a neighborhood where Black middle-income families were moving. It was a lovely neighborhood filled with families who worked hard, raised their children, and worked together as a community. We lived on a dead-end street with 10 houses. It was a little community. It was like a little community within a community. I have so many fond memories of growing up here with my sisters and brothers, walking to school, being outside till dark, playing with my friends, and civic league neighborhood events on the waterfront. It was a great place to live. I never thought of our neighborhood as a place where flooding occurred. I do recall water coming up in the yard at certain times, but it seemed normal. I remember my mom would watch the weather forecast and read the newspaper for the high tide at Sewell's Point. I had no idea what that meant. She also knew when an unusual high tide was expected and when there would be a full moon. For some reason, that was important. She kept up with that because if there was going to be some flooding, then we would prepare by moving a few things around in the garage and sometimes moving the car onto the street. But other than that, it wasn't really an issue. Through the years, the tide began to change. The flood level was a little higher and sea level rise was eating up the neighbor's land. Our next door neighbor's home was on a slab and it began to flood on a regular basis. Eventually, they were forced out by water damage and mold, and the house was torn down. Still, it didn't seem to affect us. Our home was a 2-story with an adequate crawl space. After moving away, living on my own for so long, I never thought about coming back to the community to live. But in 2008, I decided to move back to the house I grew up in to help take care of my mom along with my family. It was bittersweet because the neighborhood had changed somewhat over the years, but it turned out to really be a blessing because there were so many of us who were back in the neighborhood taking care of our parents. So I settled in here, and once again, I began to call it home. In less than a year, in 2009, when the first flood came and when I really began to understand the perfect storm, the nor'easter, the high tide, and the full moon, I remember the weatherman. We didn't call them meteorologists. Well, the weatherman predicting a nor'easter, the tide possibly 4 feet or more above normal, and there was a full moon. Now, knowing all of that, I still didn't quite grasp what was about to happen. And that was the ingredients for the perfect storm when the water would invade our home. My mom and I were sitting at the kitchen table across from one another having dinner, eating crab legs, talking and laughing. It had already begun to rain and the tide was rising as we anticipated the storm. We just kept looking outside, watching the water rise and waiting for the tide to reach its peak. We thought we were okay when the time for high tide had passed. I remember looking down through the vents in the floor and you could see water beneath the house. The wind was so strong that you could actually hear the water moving back and forth. Still, Mom and I, we continued to enjoy our crab legs. At some point, I moved my foot and felt a little splash. I saw the water slowly creeping in. I said to Mom, "Water is coming in through the vent." She laughed because she thought I was kidding. It was unthinkable that the water would actually come into the house. It was never really a consideration. We quickly began to gather things, move things that were on the floor. I can't describe to you how quickly the water started rushing in. Within minutes, we were overwhelmed. It was just like being on the beach and watching the waves rush in and rush out. It was exactly like that. It was so abrupt. We were moving things as quickly as we could. There were a few things on the floor like kitchen mats, area rugs, floor lamps, magazine baskets, footstool. I remember a large plastic container that was on the kitchen floor floating past me along with throw rugs. While I splashed around trying to move everything I could, I felt something nip at my toes. And then again and again until I realized the water had reached the electrical outlets and I was being shocked. We quickly moved upstairs to wait the storm out. It was an unbelievable experience. I remember sitting on the bed looking up, praying. By this time, the electricity had gone out. The wind was howling so loud, it was terrifying. The roof sounded as if it would literally take off. Sometime after midnight, everything stopped. It was a dead silence. At that time, we had partial electricity upstairs. The only lights were in my mom's room. I ventured downstairs to check things out, and the water had gone back out of the house. The only thing running downstairs was the refrigerator. The next morning, I discovered the water had come in about a foot, just enough to cause quite a bit of damage to everything: furniture, floors, cabinets, outlets, ductwork. And some of the pictures Sonia will display, you can see what it looked like outside. The water was at the top of the porch and stairs at low tide. You could only see the tops of shrubs, ducks playing out front. Next door, the neighbor's car was flooded midway past the windshield. I had moved our vehicles across the street to higher ground where it never floods, and still my car flooded. My brother's boat was in the neighbor's yard. My brother attempted to get us out, but the water covered the entire dead-end street up to the corner. We would have to wade through the water to get out. It took 3 days for the water to subside before we could leave our home. To prepare for the storm, we had secured everything in our detached garage way up high. When we were finally able to go in the garage, it looked like a washing machine on spin cycle. Nothing was recognizable. Tools, books, clothes, paint, mulch, grass seeds, everything was one big mess. Less than 2 years later, in 2011, it happened again, resulting in even more damage. This time I relocated Mom to my sister's house, and I worked storm trouble and was provided shelter by my employers. Sharing our experience at the Civic League meetings is where the real journey began. It's a difficult decision understanding whether to stay or to go. It's how I met so many talented and dedicated people like Skip Stiles, Mason Andrews, and some really innovative college students rendering a listening ear and possible solutions. I later was able to share my story with the New York Times, a film called Tidewater, PBS, Q Magazine, and many others. Unfortunately, I am just one of many with similar experiences, and many so much more devastating. I would like to see more resources and funding available to homeowners during the insurance process to not only repair, but to mitigate loss and help homeowners navigate through this painful process and ultimately reduce flood insurance. Flood insurance will eventually drive many of us out of our homes. What I've learned is no matter where you live, we are all vulnerable. We are really all in this together, and we have to find a way to work together. And with this climate experience, in 2018, I was very fortunate to meet and partner with a great group of passionate professionals with the Commonwealth Preservation Group who really care and are working with me to mitigate loss in my home, and along with the city's project working to mitigate flooding in our community. I'm hoping and praying that we can survive this climate experience for the better. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you for sharing your very personal story. You're very strong to continue to fight through these devastating consequences. And so to continue that effort in Norfolk, I want to introduce Kyle Spencer. He's been the Deputy Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Norfolk for the last 3 years, and his primary focus is implementing Norfolk's resilience strategy by managing complex water management, environmental, urban planning, and smart city projects.
All right, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today, and appreciate the introductions and the great company that I'm here with today. I just want to talk to you today about what the city's been doing at a much larger scale than the individual property level, and some of those problems that Karen was talking about. But some of the things we're doing on this project are going to help out the situation for folks like Karen. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it, and just give you a little bit. I know there's folks here on the call probably from all over the state and maybe other areas. So I just wanted to lay a little bit of the groundwork here of Norfolk. We're we're a very old city, and we're sort of surrounded by water on three sides. You've got, if you can see my mouse, the Chesapeake Bay way up here to the north, the Elizabeth River. This is the eastern branch of the Elizabeth River that we're talking about today. And that continues to wrap around on Broad Creek. And so when these big storm events come, or a northeast wind, the water comes into these rivers and sort of stacks up and can't flush out with the tide like it normally can. And so those persistent winds from a nor'easter really can wreak havoc on us and our residents. And so being an old city, what's happened is we've gone in over the years and filled in these old creeks that used to be partially navigation ways to kind of move around in the city, goods and services and that sort of thing in the old days. And then in the 1800s and early 1900s, we started filling these things in with something that's not really an engineered fill like you would do today. And so those areas are really where we're starting to, we're seeing the most flooding. We've kind of flood where we filled. And those are also part of the floodplain most of the time as well. So the area we're going to talk about in this presentation is the Ohio Creek. We call it the Ohio Creek watershed, which is sort of what I'm circling on the map. But the neighborhoods themselves are Chesterfield Heights and Grandy Village here on the right-hand side of this picture. And this is sort of a rendition map from like the late 1700s, early 1800s. Just looking back at Chesterfield Heights, we have this really great collection in Norfolk. Let me just hide this thing. I don't know if you guys see that or not, but that way you can see everything. In Norfolk, we've got this great collection called the Sargent Memorial Collection in the Slover Library, where you can find tons of historic photographs and records. And so as part of the project that I'm going to eventually get to here, in the early days, working with some of the residents and our partners at the university and Wetlands Watch, in the collaborative that the Sea Grant funded, I dug into some of these old photos, and this is sort of what the neighborhood looked like before it really was a neighborhood in the early 1900s. So it was platted in 1904, and then from that point on, houses and roads started coming in and being built. It was actually, when it was first built, it was actually intended for only white Norfolkians. But over time, that's obviously changed, and now it's predominantly African American and is also considered low to moderate income, which is why HUD, Housing and Urban Development, was interested in funding this project through the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And so this is just an aerial view today, what the neighborhood looks like. This is the historic. The majority of the historic houses and things are in this part where I'm circling. Karen's house is over here. There's a few other contributing structures there. Norfolk State University is here just above Interstate 264. So that's sort of the lay of the land. This is the Elizabeth River, like I said. The neighborhood is flanked by industrial facilities on the east and west. So this is a big materials handling facility on the water, coastal construction company here, and additional concrete cement plants over there. And so, like I said, in 2015, this ODU collaborative, which was Hampton University's Architectural School, Mason Andrews, and some of the engineering professors at Old Dominion through the Virginia Sea Grant funded this collaborative where we had students looking at this neighborhood that we hadn't really been paying a lot of attention to, I guess you'd say, when it comes to flooding and things. We've been looking over the years at places like The Hague near downtown and Pretty Lake to the north through some studies by engineering companies. But this area didn't have a lot of focus yet. And so these students helped bring this to our attention through their senior design project, where they met with the Civic League, like Karen said, and did a lot of interviews and groundwork, boots on the ground work with the residents, kind of getting a feel for what the needs are and what some of the shocks and stresses were. And Norfolk was going through developing a resilience strategy at this time. We were named one of the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities. And so we were developing our plans and sort of rethinking things a little bit. So we did this event called the Dutch Dialogues that summer, where we brought in experts from Holland and New Orleans and across, just kind of across the different disciplines that were experts at sort of living with water instead of just kind of forcing it back, trying to build up the walls and things and keeping water out, more of a Dutch approach of accepting it and living with the water, and daylighting some of those old creeks is some of the ideas that came out of it. And actually, it's kind of interesting, but one of the students right here, Alex, working on the project, he actually works for the primary design firm that that helped us design this project. So things kind of went full circle. Early on, Elizabeth was talking about in the other presentation about environmental justice, sort of having that participatory aspect of it by the residents. And so that's something we took very seriously. We, as you can see, had over 40 public meetings through this 2-year design process. We went to the school and met with students on a couple of occasions to talk about the playground equipment and outdoor learning classrooms, and really creating opportunities and amenities here in these communities that just have never had this in the past. And you know, it would under normal conditions be something for us that we may not take on ourselves as a city, but with HUD coming in, bringing us $120 million was the total amount of the grant award. $5 million of that was actually to fund this nonprofit that's working on resilience, innovation, and solutions, one of which is helping folks out with historic structures like Karen's house. And so, and that nonprofit is called RISE. So if you check out RISE, Resilience Innovations, if you look that up, you can find out more information on that. But as you can see, we met with a lot of partner organizations, Norfolk Redevelopment Housing Authority, this public school system, the public housing, which is Granny Village, along with the Civic League in the community, and a bunch of universities and other nonprofits that sort of were working with us on all this design for a couple of years. And so in 2000, the award was actually in 2016 by HUD as part of the National Disaster Resilience Competition. The funding didn't come to us until 2017. And originally they gave us until 2022 to complete the project. Since then, with COVID and everything, we've been working with HUD and Congress to actually get an extension of that so that we have a little more time to make sure this project is meeting national objectives and doing all the things we've promised to the community. But I'll just take you through some of the infrastructure we're building and sort of how that meets these objectives and goals that we had. So we're gonna, normally when you exit this neighborhood, there's only 2 ways in and out. There's this way to the west and this way to the north. And this way to the west would flood quite often and would just sort of trap folks. So then there's only one way out. And if there's an issue with this interstate or something like that, you're kind of left stuck here until things go back to normal. So what we decided to do is raise this road out of the floodplain in good ways, remove it from the industrial facility. So right now the road goes right through the middle of a concrete cement plant. We're taking it away from that, building a walking multi-use bike trail here on the side of it, creating new wetlands in some of these areas, and also building some berm around to prevent that coastal water from inundating these residents. There were 2 houses actually here where the berm is that we've purchased and we're taking down and relocating residents. And so we're in the process, and that was part of our reasoning for extending the grant, just to make sure we had time to do that properly under the Uniform Relocation Act. But as the coastal protection moves around the river here, I'll just keep going to the east. There's a kind of a segment where we don't have a lot of space. We're going to put a T-wall, and I have pictures and renderings of all this here in a second. We're going to build a berm or like a dike, kind of a levee. Different words kind of mean basically the same thing, but just like a nice grassy knoll that will keep the river out. But in front of that, we're going to have layers of protection. We're going to have living shoreline, oyster reefs, and all that kind of stuff to create great habitat and even educational opportunities for folks in Norfolk State University or Old Dominion or the STEM Academy here at Chesterfield Academy. Listening to the residents, they remember coming out and being connected to the river and the water and fishing. So we're building a fishing pier. There's an old road called Marlboro Avenue that was brick paved, one of the last brick paved roads in Norfolk. But unfortunately, to build the resilience infrastructure, we needed to tear that up. But we're working with the Historic Resources Department in Richmond to as a cooperating agency, just to make sure that we're basically we saved as many bricks as we could as part of that process, and we're going to repurpose those in the park over here to the right, underneath the benches is our plan. And so we're working on that with them. We're going to build a big pump station here. All these blue dashed lines are new stormwater pipes, a smaller pump station back here. And again, this is a little berm that's going to go around the back of these houses to keep this wetlands from flooding in from the back, like during those nor'easter events. We're going to have a tide gate here to actually prevent it from coming in under the major events as well. We're going to widen this underpass here. This is kind of a dark, scary place to walk underneath and go to the Tide light rail station and the bus stops up here, or Norfolk State. And so we're going to widen that and lighten it up, put some lights under there. Lots of green infrastructure going in some of these intersections along the roadway. This park is going to be really amazing. It's kind of one of these things that can flood and go back to normal really quickly. So it's sort of designed that way as part of even a stormwater storage facility. The berm will kind of wind its way to the edge, and we're going to create new basketball courts and playground things around the rec center that's already there. And then around the school, we've replaced all the playground equipment and can sort of rearrange this so that it's a better loop and a way for parents to drop off kids. And then we're creating, this is an old creek that we're basically daylighting and sort of connecting it to the rest of the system in a better way so it can manage stormwater. And again, this berm wraps around. The road is getting raised here as well. We just want better egress and ingress for public safety during major events and things like that. So, and there's some numbers over here, sort of how many trees we're planting. There's just a whole lot going into this project, and this really doesn't even quite do it justice. But just to keep going, I want to slide through some sort of precedent examples of what we're talking about. When I'm talking about a living shoreline, it's got some rock in front of it. The oyster reefs will be out here, and this sort of allows this marsh to grow and protects it. And then that will transition to more of a berm, and there's revetment and rock protecting this from waves. There's a navigation channel, so we get some wakes and waves. And this is what that wall would look like, sort of a typical cement wall. When I talk about bioswales and green infrastructure, this is what we're talking about in the verge, kind of between the curb and the sidewalk, just creating more places for water to soak into the ground and slowly be released into the system so that we're not overwhelming the stormwater system and pump station. This is a rendering of the new pump station. I've got some other ones. And again, when we replaced the brick pavers on Marlboro, I don't think I mentioned this before, but we're replacing them with Pervious pavers. And we worked with the residents, met them on a Saturday, and we laid out bricks and we put out patterns and colors and let them pick what they wanted from the street itself. This is that park I was talking about. This is a bird's eye view looking out towards the river. There's the Granny Village Learning Center, the Elizabeth River Project parks its barge out there a lot. There's a swimming pool that was already existing, but we're really connecting this road over here and creating this plaza. We heard a lot from the residents about having things like chess tables and barbecue pits and picnic tables along here, just things that don't exist in this neighborhood now. Lots of walking trails and sort of outdoor learning space as well for the students. Some other renderings of this one got a little fuzzy, but this is sort of what that plaza would look like and that new playground. It's going to be the nice soft surface for them to play basketball on and that sort of thing. Here's a rendering of that fishing pier. So as you come down Ballentine Boulevard and you pass by the pump station, we're going to have a little window in there so you can see inside and see the numbers moving and the graphs and everything as the machine works, or you know, most of the time it's not running, it's just sort of there when the big storm comes. And then you can come out here on this fishing pier and get out over the water pretty far and kind of see up and down the river. So that's going to be really nice. Just a couple of quick highlights. We started construction on this actually in 2020 during COVID, right before COVID. The governor came down, we had a ceremonial groundbreaking, and since then we've spent over 50 million of the construction dollars. We're doing about $109 million of construction. Some of that is actually for water and sewer. As we're tearing up the road, we might as well make everything better. And it's, like I said, it's an old neighborhood from the early 1900s. So everybody got new sewer and water hookups as part of this project. We're on track to be done by 2022, in late 2022. This is a bird's eye view of that living shoreline and berm going in along Chesterfield Boulevard. You can see these nice, like Karen said, every house is a little different. It's a really beautiful street, and you know, doesn't look that way now, but it's going to be really beautiful, and we'd love to have folks down here and show them around when construction is completed. Here's a view of that berm from the east looking towards the west. Here's a picture I took kind of standing on it so you can get a feel for the scale a little bit. Here's that pump station I was talking about. So it's coming out of the ground. It actually has a roof on it now since I took this picture, or we had this picture done. This is a guy's shirt in the background, just to give you a sense of scale. So it's about 30 feet below the surface of the ground for the wet wells and all that. Large pipes. So we've been studying water and flooding in Norfolk for many years, and we're seeing tides are happening more often and flooding more. The rain is coming down stronger and faster, more frequently, and so we're building kind of everything bigger and better. This is what that pump station is going to look like when we're done. Again, as you walk down the sidewalk, you can go straight out to the pier. There's going to be a kiosk here, some educational information. There's going to be this window in the side. There's a little shelter here in case it rains while you're out there to hide under. And then this little plaza area is kind of the vaults for the pump, but this could be used, you know, as a market, you know, farmer's market or something for the residents if they'd like, or a little gathering space. This is Marlboro Avenue. It's completely torn up now. All the bricks are gone. We're putting in new sidewalks and aprons and curb and gutter and all that now, and getting ready to lay down this herringbone pattern brick Pervious pavers. So underneath this road will be layers of rock and soil and things, and eventually pipes, and so all that water can filter through, be cleaned a little bit before it goes into the river. So and that's just you know, another way we're trying to meet our resilience goals. And this is that park, just again under construction. A big culvert's being built here. A small undersized one was there before. This is public housing to the right. And a little bit there in the background, but you can kind of see the berm coming around, new courts, basketball courts. The soft surface hasn't been put down yet. And the students just came back in March, so we've been closely working with them on all that. And again, this is what that's going to look like when we're all done here in another year or so. So that's all I've got. I'll stop there and let the next folks go, or I can take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Kyle. We're going to hold questions to the end, but I do want to mention that working, I think, with the city, the Norfolk Preservation Collaborative and other partners are bringing a national conference to the Norfolk area in May 2022 called Keeping History Above Water. So look out for information about that. And I'm sure this will be one of those projects that's highlighted. Yeah. Environmental justice takes many forms. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. Lakshmi Fjord. She is an environmental justice anthropologist and visiting scholar at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Virginia. She now works with 5 environmental justice communities in Virginia whose historic resources, health, and community viability are threatened by various development projects. So welcome, and we'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much. And I am having a little bit of technical difficulties. And so I am going to ask if I could share my screen. And hopefully this slideshow that disappeared this morning is there. So here we go. This is why we needed the time to go to practice, which we did. But then, yeah, I apparently have had a total breakdown between my. So what I'm going to ask is, can we go to questions while I switch to my other computer? This computer is just frankly not working. And this highlights one of the issues that I'm raising, which is about what happens when you have low internet, you have low tech, you have volunteer people working with, old equipment. And this is sort of characteristic of all of the communities in which I'm working, as well as myself. So I'm going to have to switch to my, it's actually my older computer. Thank you.
Well, we'll welcome any questions in the Q&A, but I'll introduce Naya.
Good afternoon. My name is Naya Bates, and I'm currently a graduate student at Princeton University, where I'm studying environmental history, historic preservation, history, and issues related to Black rural communities. So I'm happy to join today and to facilitate our conversation. We've already had a couple questions in the chat, so we'll go ahead and answer those while Dr. Ford gets switched to her older computer. Katie Whitehead asked in the chat, what level how much sea level rise do we expect in the community in Norfolk? And maybe
so we designed, I didn't mention this, the coastal protection is going to be at 11 feet NAVD 88, North American Vertical Datum 1988, which is sort of 0 would be like mean sea level. So, and that is the 100-year base flood elevation, which is about 8 feet plus 2.5 feet of sea level rise. So we've designed this to 2.5 feet of sea level rise, which is what we expect in about 50 to 75 years, depending on what scientists you talk to or what curve you're looking at. So 2.5 feet of sea level rise is what we're expecting, or we designed to, and we're protecting to the 100-year flood level on your flood insurance rate map is what that is. We did not seek FEMA certification on this. That would have kind of broke our budget, so to speak, but we think folks will be able to, apply for LOMAs and other things on their property.
Great, thank you, Kyle. There's another question in the chat from Susan, and she asks, oh, sorry, I lost the question.
Where the water goes?
Yes, where does the water from the pumping stations go?
Yeah, so the pump is, we're going to build essentially like a bathtub rim, right, with this coastal protection. So we've got to get the water over the bathtub back into the Eastern Elizabeth River. So that's where it goes. It will, it'll be, we're trying to slow everything down so it doesn't all just, the old days you would just send the water to the street, to the pipe, to the pump station. Now with this design, we're trying to soak it up in the ground as much as we can, slow it down and release it slowly back into the river. And in theory, that's cleaner, right, and better for the river. But it's the eastern branch of the Elizabeth River.
Thank you, Kyle. And we have one more question for you.
Sure.
You mentioned during your presentation that you are relocating 2 houses to accommodate a levee. And we'd like to know if, as part of your plans, you're going to be elevating any of the existing houses.
Not a part of this grant. We weren't allowed to do work on elevate personal property or do anything like that. So these are kind of like buyouts by HUD, and so we actually provide. We're required to replace their housing with in-kind housing. So they're most of these were like duplexes, so they're kind of like apartments within a house. And so, yeah, we're in the process of relocating all them, but no house elevations were a part of this project. It's wasn't part of our original application, to HUD.
Thank you, Kyle. I have a question for Ms. Spates. You are still living in the neighborhood, but it seems difficult to do so. Why do you choose to stay?
Sometimes it seems the easiest solution to just move. But because there are so many issues in our city with flooding, I can walk out of one situation into another. And I believe that with this project to mitigate flooding, that I would possibly be in one of the safer areas after the project is done.
You will,
so,
yeah.
So what I didn't want to do was to walk away before the miracle happens, So, and then I have ties to the neighborhood. This is the home I grew up in, it's paid for, but also I have to I'm doing some extensive remodeling to make it my own. So I just thought that this probably was the safest place for me.
Wonderful, thank you. I really love that idea that you didn't want to walk away from your historic community before the miracle happens. That's amazing. We have another question in the chat from Emily, and she asks, knowing that Mrs. Spates pays an outrageously high amount of flood insurance, do we know if the Ohio Creek project will mitigate any of those insurance costs by changing the flood concerns in the area?
So like I said, we weren't able to build to a FEMA certification level. However, so the entire system will not remove this from the floodplain. That's not what we were trying to do or we're able to do. But individuals, because we are changing some of the ground elevations around the properties, building little berms behind some of the little smaller creeks and things, I would encourage residents to apply for a letter of map amendment and on their property to see if FEMA would do that. But the project as a whole is not removing this neighborhood from the floodplain like it would if we were building to like their certification standard, which is much higher and much would have caused a lot more negative impact, we think, to the neighborhood. Actually, more houses would have had to been taken out, more things like that, and the cost would have been a struggle.
Thank you. Ms. Spates, would you like to chime in on that?
Yes, I just would like to add to that's what I'm betting on. We were told that it was possible that the flood insurance due to this project could possibly be reduced maybe by 25%. And also the project that I'm working on to remodel my home is to mitigate loss. So I'm hoping that along with both of those things that I can reduce my costs. My flood insurance at the moment is $4,800 per year.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. And I've been able to stay and afford it because the home is paid for. But, now I'm, spending a considerable amount of money here. And honestly, the only way to maintain that, is to have the flood insurance reduced. So it's a big part of it.
Yeah, I would just, partly because you're here, Karen, is the city is part of the community rating system with FEMA and NFIP, which we were a level 7, which gave everybody in the flood hazard zone that had flood insurance 15% off of their insurance. Just this week, we found out that we've been working really hard to get down to a 5. And so we just found out this week, we are now a CRS class 5, which will give 25% off of all residents in the city of Norfolk that are in the flood zone and have flood insurance.
So when did we get what did you say?
25%.
No, the amount before.
It was 15%.
So we already have that?
Yeah.
Because mine just went up.
Yeah, well, so when
$400.
trying to actualize these, so they're also, it's been subsidized, the flood insurance program for many years, but they're trying to get that back. So sometimes you won't actually see it on the bill because as we get as low, was raising it, but we're on our way to a 3, and a 3 would even get us, I forget what the percentage is. It's either 35 or 40%. And we're well on our way to that by, I think next year we'll be there. So
wonderful.
The city as a whole to get everybody down the best we can without large scale infrastructure like this.
Great, thank you both. I think Dr. Ford may be ready to try again on her presentation. So we'll go back to Dr. Ford.
Okay, I'm now gonna I'm gonna find my screen. So here we go.
You may have to put your cursor to the bottom of the screen and it should, there you
go. Okay, thanks for your incredible patience. What I'm going to need to do is really speed through. I was hoping to talk with you about this publication in the New York Times and the Washington Post, that 5 university study about environmental injustices based on health impacts, that Black people, no matter their income level, are exposed to much greater than average concentrations of PM 2.5 in particular. So what that's amounted to for the work that I do in communities is that equation that our community studies are working to address. That environmental justice is the root driver of rapid climate change in the US, and that it's also the root driver of racial disparities and also in intergenerational wealth passing of heritage lands. I think everybody is aware of this, so I just made this list because I offered to cover some of the access and systemic issues that we face, but everyone on here is an expert, and I am going to make my complete PowerPoint available to everyone, considering all of the issues that I've had, and I really want each community to be well represented, which they won't be fully today. But as you all know, that the absence of archived historic resources from Indigenous and Freedmenville communities in Virginia is absolutely fundamental. And then lack of access. So when I started working with my neighbors in Buckingham and Union Hill, it's rural. There was no GPS points at all at that point. So I had to drive with my car and just hand map everything. We used USPS postal addresses. Very many people, there was no cell phone coverage whatsoever. And there was just the library, which, as you all know, and during COVID, these are the places that have been closed. So the other thing that I want to point out but won't discuss is the lack of funding by foundations to community groups. That mostly that money is given to established nonprofits who have a record, which we understand, but what that means is that the very people who are doing all of the environmental justice, you want to say ground truthing, the ethnographic research, are not being paid. So all that work is volunteer, and it creates huge economic disadvantages and sacrifices. So, okay, these are the 5 communities that I hope to cover. Most of you are familiar with Union Hill because of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline Compressor Station, which, if you can see my cursor I don't know, here, but now it's being threatened by open pit gold mining. The county has opened the door to open pit mining. Then Pine Grove in Cumberland has a mega landfill, which is, euphemistically being called waste recycling. In Hanover County, here we have the Brown Grove community that's threatened by a mega Wegmans distribution center. And then Charles City County, which here we go. Charles City County has a mega landfill, coal and gas-fired plants still remaining from many issues that they were facing. Other sites that have since been, luckily, because of all their work, stopped. Then finally, in the Bannister district of Pittsylvania County, the MVP Southgate wants to intersect with a Transco easement, and that would make a compressor station there the third. This is a photo of Donald Apgar because on August 28th, 2017, I convened and organized the People's Tribunal, the Seville People's Tribunal on Human Rights and Environmental Justice Impacts of frack gas infrastructure. Why is that interesting now? Because there were 64 testifiers from across both the ACP and MVP together for the first time. We were putting our heads together and we discovered these systemic issues that were happening. Here's the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, environmental justice systemic issues, and then the systemic issues along the Mountain Valley Pipeline related to Appalachian people. So the communities that we included as environmental justice, as per Robert Bullard's definition that includes Appalachians, African American, Native American, Appalachian, and rural people. Some of those rural issues relate to what I mentioned in terms of access, ability, lack of ability to engage in public participation. Also, as we know, it's led to very few historic preservation resources in these rural freedmen-built communities, in particular in Virginia. So yeah, not time to talk about my personal relationships to this, but it's very key. How did a white woman who was born in Ohio and grew up fighting for integration in segregated Cincinnati by busing myself to quote unquote the ghetto in the early to mid 60s, and then ended up helping to start Yogaville, Virginia in Buckingham County. So I really early got involved with local African-American people that were providing a lot of the services that I wanted to participate in. I made every mistake that you can imagine in the book. And I'm telling you that because it was very important when later, as a 40-year-old, I started my PhD in anthropology, and then later was called on as my spiritual practice and ministry to do this work, to do community-led participatory action research to try to stop the Atlantic Coast Pipeline's compressor station in Union Hill. I already had learned that I could not be at the head of this, that in these places of historic discrimination, it was absolutely essential that we form really close relationships where we could talk over the issues, the reasons why people wouldn't speak up, the reasons why they had been retaliated against for generations for even saying the word racism. Therefore, in the beginning, I was told that even though we needed to fill in environmental justice issues and the Historic Preservation Act erasures of this community, they didn't initially want us to ask about race because they were afraid of what actually happened, which was Dominion Energy came in 2018 after the Governor's Advisory Council on Environmental Justice held a meeting in Buckingham County, and it highlighted the environmental justice issues we had been placing in the public record from the beginning. The strategy was you have to have local experts, you have to identify the households, develop questions, interviews, and then find out, you have to map people and their historic cultural landscapes in order to make permit evidence placed in the legal records or permits. That's the only way that you can have lawsuits, and then that became the basis of all of our historic preservation submissions. So I have to bow to and honor absolutely the work of Mr. Charles White, who spent 45 plus years looking in alternate sources and created 2 books on his Buckingham Black history. Now, necessarily that history was about Buckingham families, Black families, because on the night the 15th Amendment passed, which was to enforce the voting rights of freed males, which in Buckingham were 2 times the number of former Confederate males, the courthouse was burned to the ground, burning all records of enslavement by wills, by purchases of their freedom. So his work, and land records. So his work couldn't help us to do the site-specific historic cultural data that ended up leading to our PIF. Mr. White's the one who sent me to UVA University of Virginia Special Collections, which the entire 45 years of his work had been closed to him as a man of color. These were plantation family records held in secret. And then finally UVA stopped that for all the right reasons, saying we're not going to protect enslavement records. This is all our holdings are for everyone. And that happened to coincide when Mr. White and I needed this information to apply for most endangered historic place listing with Preservation Virginia, which we received in May of 2016. This gives you an example of the kind of inductive research that's required. If you can see me, there's Fleming is the name of an enslaved person who was born in 1856, enslaved at Variety Shade Plantation, which was the plantation from whose lands Dominion bought 63.5 acres for their compressor station site. Once their first site that they had purchased was identified as being next to the historic plantation lands of Buckingham's white Commonwealth's attorney and the county administrator who was going to be shepherding the permit and all processes about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. So immediately they looked for another site, found a site that Dominion hoped wouldn't have a bunch of pushback that turned out to be former Variety Shade lands, which I only found out because I looked at the deed and called the person on the deed. So we see the name Fleming. That becomes part of the Shelton family, and that was the Shelton family store, and we start to follow the thread. This is a hard to read and looks upside down, but isn't upside down because this was also found in special collections. And this map formed the basis of the preliminary information form, or PIF, that I wrote based on the ground truthing with all of the families living in this area about their households, their burial sites. But what you might be able to see is the fact that Hardwicksville Road right here is where the compressor station site was going to go. It's the present day James River Highway, and these other roads and this creek all still exist and sort of identify that the historic character of this back into the 1700s. So what were we up against? We were up against the erasure of the community. First Dominion tried to say that there was no one there. For this site, they offered the entire Buckingham County, which is this whole outline, average census tract data. Census tract data and misuses of census tract data are one of the most important, I should say, misuses and environmental justice issues in Virginia. So by saying that only the average of the whole county, which is very rural and sparsely populated, 29.6 people, was for this site, which you see encircled here, actually allowed the dense cluster of people who actually lived there disappear. Now, this was a later iteration that Dominion tried to do. They took the 3 intersecting census tracts and said, no census tract, this census tract, this is located in census tracts that are 70% white. But again, that's why we had to do the door-to-door research to try to find out exactly who's there. So what is this? These are the US mailbox markers in which I drove my car around and then wrote them down and then made maps in which, this is pre-GIS again, where we then did our study teams in which we held a workshop, we did NIH protocol training, learned how to talk about pre-existing health conditions in a place where people didn't even open their door to census takers. So you can understand how sensitive this was, how important it was that the people they were opening their door to were their fellow congregants at the Union Hill Baptist Church, Black Baptist Church, and the Union Grove Black Baptist Church. And these are some of the details of the amounts of people that we found. This is that historic Hardwicksville Road. And I need to say, this is all Monacan lands. And this road was called by whites, colonists, warrior route, because the copper mines here, the Monacan copper mines here, the Monacan people for trade would take them all the way up to Wingina, which is was on both sides, is still on both sides of the James River, and prior was Monahassenaw. And just as an aside, I brought that site to the attention of the University of Virginia, and with the Monacan people and Jeff Hanton, professor there, they identified it as Monahassenaw, one of the 5 Monacan cities, villages cited in historic documents. This is my hand map, okay? It's very crude, but this is what I had to do, was take a topo for the compressor station and then lay the oral narratives I was hearing about whose historic land is here and what sites are here. And that was done later by ground truthing. So for example, John Laurie and Ada Claiborne, Washington, who went to the Union Grove segregated school, looked for their school site, which no longer is on the ground, and found it based on the daffodils that they had planted when they were kids. So it's that level of ground truthing that has to happen. Again, no one size fits all. It requires just yeoman work on all of the parts of the people working on it. Mr. Charles Jefferson Harper's oral history, for the very first time, he said he spoke to me about his being a descendant of Betsy Hemings, whose father was Thomas Jefferson, and his description of the hundreds of unmarked slave burials led us to this site that that Sonia has been to, Preservation Virginia has mapped, and of course has been a major part of our district. And it was very important to say that it was very hostile audiences that we were giving these permit evidences before. So we invented the idea of comment parties and got funding to have food and play music and pray and gather and divide up our comments to make sure that we got them all in within the short oral history, oral time given. And just really quickly, this has been very fruitful. We've had 2 historic wins based on this, as most people know. On January 7, 2020, the 4th Circuit Court cited the community study demographic, in the hearing, forced both Dominion's Council and the state of Virginia to admit that the door-to-door household study was more methodologically sound, and that that it found that this was a 83.5% African American and Native American descendant community. A goodly number of people identify as both. And then as you know, on December 10th, the board of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources granted eligibility for the historic register to our Union Hill Rural Historic District, which they told us was the first time in Virginia history that a Freedmen built community had received this protective status. And they cited the ethnographic cultural landscape methods, which involved this door-to-door work and then creating these maps, and which the plantation homes that are extant and also that are non-extant, so 3 are still standing, get their significance only because they were built by Union Hill's enslaved ancestors. So now I segue so rapidly to my beloved, also a project that I work really closely on, which is the Pine Grove community in Cumberland County. And this is a historic map that I just wanted to show you because quickly I was trying to restore while it was, you couldn't see me. On December 12, 2019, Pine Grove School received Virginia Historic Register status, and then on February 25th, also the National Register status. I hope all of you are very familiar with Mrs. Muriel Miller Branch, who has been the director of the AMMD Pine Grove project, which already was in existence and working to pay the taxes on the Pine Grove Rosenwald School, and then was working to get restoration going when they received notice that an enormous, the Green Ridge mega landfill, which is purported to be, you know, waste recycling, was going to be on, I can't see it, on all 3 sides. They were going to, this was going to become an island. This will become an island if this happens, in the middle of 695 feet of toxic landfill, causing, as all of you know from Petersburg's issues, an enormous smell, contamination of their water wells. But in this call, this webinar, I want to talk about the historic register issues of this. Behind the Rosenwald School are many of the AMMD, which are these 4 primary historic families whose ancestors built the Rosenwald School, raised the vast amount of the monies, from whom their teachers came from those families. And this school became the center of community life. I mean, they had plays there, they had Thanksgiving there, they had a turkey run there, they did everything here. They had a maypole. And so that all started in 1917. And this is a 2-room, as you can probably see from the size of the models. And then in 1974, it began its next incarnation as a community center. So behind this are many unmarked slave burials, enslaved people, and freedmen family burials that would be covered up by this landfill. And this is just one of the, this is Mrs. Branch's ancestors' graves. And as you can see, this is very common. It's a handmade concrete marker in which they've taken a stick and made a headstone very lovingly to mark the place of her ancestor. Moving along to the Brown Grove community. This community is threatened by a 21 football field sized, which is like the size of the Pentagon, Wegmans distribution center. Now that might sound kind of benign. We all, you know, a lot of people love to go to Wegmans, although most of us have stopped going there, because it is going to have the following, oh, sorry, I jumped. Oh, I lost the data. Okay, this is the Brown Grove Church, which is a historic Freedmen-built church whose matriarch and her descendants all live on the roads right around this. So again, exactly like Union Hill, what you have is a county in which the majority is very strongly white, But the most impacted people are densely clustered African-American people who are historic. And they have been working really hard and done a really good job, because now the Brown Grove Baptist Church, with the help of people on this call, has received historic district eligibility. And we're working together on the household study. I'm working closely with this community, and they're doing a household study and a heritage study to get the kinship to create a map to lay on top of the larger, the larger impacts. And right over here is an airport. So get the idea that over 390 diesel-fired trucks are going to be idling here, not just driving here, but idling here as they load and unload at this distribution center. This is a regional airport in which planes may be used for distribution, and those cause both of those types of emissions cause the PM 2.5 that I discussed in the beginning of this presentation. And then I take us quickly to Charles City County, that had 2 proposed merchant frac gas plants within 1 mile of each other, a header improvement frac gas pipeline, and a mega landfill expansion. And this one is still in place, as is one of the merchant gas plants. The mega landfill expansion will engulf entirely the St. Mary's battlefield, where U.S. colored troops played a large role, and where it is known, and people have relatives from those troops buried in those proposed cells that are now, there's an Army Corps of Engineers 2 permits out. One is a memoranda of understanding about the historic resources, and the other, they have a lawsuit against the State Water Control Board for the water permit. And then this is what you see in the, of this, it's really hard to tell where those frac gas are going, and the mega landfill. And I tried to upload, and I will upload, a map of the landfill site with the St. Mary's battlefield on it, which has been deemed eligible for historic register since the very first landfill permit in the 1990s. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ford, for that very thorough presentation of so many communities who are fighting these same set of challenges. We are so thankful for what you have shared. If there are any questions from our audience, please drop them in our chat or the Q&A. We've got just a couple minutes, and we'll try our best to get to your questions. There was a question earlier that we didn't get to go to, and I wondered if Kendall could tell us about 1 or 2 things that you're most excited about with the Environmental Justice Committee.
With the Environmental Justice Council?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, so okay, 1 or 2 things that I'm excited about. So I am excited because this year the council is going to have 2 co-chairs. And one of those co-chairs is Reverend Dr. Faith Harris. So she is a tireless advocate for environmental justice, and she has a lot of new ideas of how to make the functioning and the format of the council meetings more inclusive and allow more time for public comment. So I'm very excited about that. And then the second thing that I'm excited about, I don't think I really went too much into this during my presentation, but I think I at least mentioned that there is a new interagency environmental justice working group that's kind of looking internally at the procedures like in the state agencies here. And so the other thing that I'm excited about is that the EJ Council is supposed to have some type of a role with that. So I'm looking forward to that bit of accountability to kind of like really like look inside and see what's going on. I'm not, again, like it's been pretty frustrating joining the council because again, the council has no power. Like remember this, like the council literally has no power. Like its role is to make recommendations, but still that's really important with just kind of spotlighting issues, spotlighting communities, and spotlighting action that should have already been happened, but has not happened yet. So that's some of the things I'm excited for.
Thanks, Kendall. Actually, we do have a couple of questions rolling in. So we have one question that asks, what can we do to prevent the landfill in Cumberland to protect Pine Grove? And what can we do to prevent the Wegmans distribution center and other similar projects? And anyone who would like to respond, please do.
I would like to ask Sonia Branch, wait, sorry, Sonia, I always get your name wrong. Sonia Branch Wilson, who made a really good comment in the chat and who is a very active community member, and her mother is Ms. Muriel. So I'd like her to make a comment on that, please. Are you still on, Sonia?
I don't think that they can.
Oh shoot. Okay, sorry. She wrote just a note. I would like to direct everyone to the chat where she gave personal testimony to the headstone that I showed. And I would really like, I will send, I don't know where I would post this on Preservation Virginia. Links, that's one of the things that didn't work, where you could have taken a screenshot of the links to all of the community websites in which community members have posted exactly what you can do. So I pledge to do that. But importantly, if you go to the AMMD Pine Grove project, just Google that. I believe it will take you to a website that will update you. And I think the most important overall thing is to get on mailing lists so that you know about your opportunities to make public comments. I mean, it's really important to make comments based on technical knowledge, and certainly personal impacts are highly important. But it's also really important to send comments to the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality so that we can shift this, constant targeting and locating of these sites in communities that we most need to preserve, because all of this history is causing this huge swath. And if just this many right now, and I didn't include nearly all of them, are facing imminent threats, then imagine how that then piles up year after year after year. And so we want to be the change at every level, individual, family, county, state, and federal levels, to make the changes we have to make. So I apologize for not having all those links for you. And I just know that if you Google these, C5 is the name of the Concerned Citizens of Charles City County group. And the Brown Grove community, I don't have a website for, but I will definitely give you contacts.
One thing that we do when we have this recording on our website, we can put those links in at the end of the recording too.
Thank you. So we are short on time, so we'll make this the final question. And this question relates to what changes need to happen within the cultural resource management industry so that issues of environmental justice are better addressed. And perhaps I will turn this question over to Julie Langen and Elizabeth Lipford from DHR.
Thank you, Naya. I'll just lead off by saying that like so many things in life, more funding would make a huge difference in our ability to be prepared for these types of projects and our review of them. And so capacity is always a concern that I have as director of the Department of Historic Resources. I just want to share that in the last General Assembly session, we were given additional funding for 3 new positions, which I think are really going to be very helpful dealing with the issues that we've been discussing today. We're going to have, for the first time, a full-time community outreach coordinator that will be working with local communities who are going through these efforts to document local history. That is already under recruitment. We will have funding to develop an internship program with HBCUs to start cultivating a more diverse professional staff, and we'll also have some grants that can help communities in this regard. We're going to be hiring an underwater archaeologist, and that may not sound relevant, but actually it is, because there are a number of important cultural sites that are already underwater, and unfortunately, as we've been talking about, and Kyle demonstrated very clearly, more and more of our terrestrial sites are going to be underwater. And then finally, we're hiring a full-time cemetery person just to deal with historic cemeteries, to work with communities, custodians of those. And we know that there's a lot of work to be done documenting African-American cemeteries. So we're going to be making progress in that regard. So my answer is just to say, you know, it's going to get better. It's definitely going to get better. But we've been limited by our capacity, and that's about to improve, thankfully. So Elizabeth, would you want to answer anything from the perspective of someone who works in the regional office?
Sure. So I work in the Eastern Regional Office. We have 2 other regional offices, Northern Virginia and then the far Southwest Virginia. All of the projects that Lakshmi talked about today are in our Eastern Regional Office, and there's 2 of us, have been involved in, some more involved in others and some more on the periphery. And so, you know, that is, as Julie mentioned, capacity. We're a small staff, but we're trying to be responsive to a multitude of interests, from individual property owners to organizations like the Pine Grove community, as well as local governments are our clients as well, and trying to encourage them to do better planning up front instead of having these things happen on the back end, which is unfortunate for everybody involved. So that is our role as a community, where the Community Services Division is to be a resource for organizations, and a resource that you don't have to pay for, to help and with these. And the other thing is that the frustration of doing research in different localities in Virginia, particularly with the pandemic and everything closed, is something that we all in this profession experience now. And some counties in Virginia simply don't have the records. Either they were burned, or they were destroyed during the Civil War. They've been lost. So, and then some counties will have their records that go back to the 17th century. So it really is detective work on a case-by-case basis. So those that have the fortitude to stay with it will find rewards, as Lakshmi did with Union Hill. So that can be a positive thing too, but it does take fortitude. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, we would like to thank everyone for attending today. I'm also dropping a correction in the chat. I believe I sent the wrong link with the Pine Grove article, but I've been trying to keep up with everything that has been coming in through the comments and also happening in our discussion. So I'd just like to take a second to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for trusting us to come into your communities and to work in these sensitive locations with often very sensitive and tense issues related to preserving the history of people of color, and especially these deeply rural places. So we thank you for sharing with us today. We thank our audience. We hope that you all will remain committed to confronting issues related to the intersections of environmental justice and historic preservation. And we hope that you attend future events by Preservation Virginia. So with that, I will turn it back over to Sonia to close us out.
Elizabeth, do you want to say a few words?
No, I'd just like to thank Ms. Bates for moderating this session and for being so flexible. And thank you all that have stayed with us. Thank you to our panelists. As I started out by saying, this is a much more complex and broad issue, and we are only dipping our toe into it. But I think in order to move forward, it's going to take all of us and more to engage in these issues and to look for a path forward that really recognizes and honors this history. So thank you. Do stay tuned to Preservation Virginia for more programming, as well as alerts when there are opportunities for public comment on some of these projects. We try to get that word out. So please remain with us as you can through our different communication channels. And thanks again to our panelists and our moderator and everyone that joined us. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.